Labadiena, gerbėmieji knygų mėgėjai ir sveikinusi su jumis šiandien su visais tais, kurie ypač mėgsta kriminalinius romanus, detektyvus, tačiau be abejo ir su tais, kurie šiaip mėgsta gerą literatūrą. Ir šiandien man labai malonu pristatyti mūsų pašnekovą, tai bus Abiras Mukherjee, rašytojas, kurio 3 knygos jau yra išėjusios lietuvių kalba. Jų pavadinimai yra Kalkutos detektyvas, Neišvengiamas blogis ir Dūmai ir pelenai. Tai yra vakarų Škotijoje užaugęs imigrantų iš Indijos sūnus, šiuo metu jis gyvena su šeima Londone ir jo kriminaliniai romanai domina ne tik tai tuos, kurie mėgsta detektyvinės istorijas, bet ir tuos, kurie domisi istoriniais romanais, nes jo knygose apjungiamas kriminalinis veiksmas su Indijos 20-ojo amžiaus pradžios istorija. Na ir jo knygos bent jau man patinka labai tuo, kad jos yra labai šmaikščiai parašytos. Taigi, tai galima būtų apibūdinti šį rašytoją ir jo knygas kaip vieną iš tų pavyzdžių, kai yra sujungiamas pramoginis pradas ir kai sujungiama literatūra, iš kurios galime sužinoti daugiau informacijos apie tą laikotarpį, galime sužinoti daugiau istorinių detalių. Na ir dabar mes pasikalbėsime su pačiu autoriumi ir dar aš norėjau pridurti, kad visas šias 3 knygas lietuvių kalba yra išvertusi Rasa Drazdauskienė, kuri yra tikrai puikiai vertėja ir puikiai kriminalinių romanų žinovė ir visas knygas yra išleidusi ir leidykla Tyto Alba. Nu, dabar jau sveikinuosi ir su mūsų šios dienos svečiu. So, hello, Abir.
Hi, how are you, Audrius?
Yeah, I'm fine. And first of all, I would like to welcome you online. And I think many Lithuanian readers also are very glad to see you, because I know that there are many fans of your creation, of your books here in Lithuania, and not only ones who like crime fiction, but for example, the ones who like historical fiction as well, because in your books you deal with I think a really interesting historical period. You write about 20th century, the beginning of 20th century, about India at these times. And but I think we'll talk about it later. But at the beginning, I would like to ask you about these strange times when we meet, because we meet at the times of coronavirus. And how are you spending these times? Because when I talk about creativity and when I talk to some writers, some of them, they say that it's the best time for them. They say more coronavirus, more pandemic, please, because they just spend their time at home. They just nobody disturbs them, and others say what they are stuck. They don't write. They cannot write. They cannot concentrate. How it's about you?
Well, for me, as you can see, I'm stuck in my basement, and this is how I get through the day. With my whiskey is how I survive the time. No, seriously, though, it hasn't been too bad. And as a family, we've been very lucky. Everyone is well. My wife is, work is very good. I've been all right with the writing. It started off this time last year, March, April last year was very difficult. I couldn't write anything for a month and a half, just because of the change to routine and everything that was going on. And I remember talking to people, to other writers, and they said, well, if you can write something now, there's probably something wrong with you. But after that, after April, I think we all got into a new routine, and we settled down. And I think I had a very productive few months, to be fair. We're writers, we're in lockdown half the time anyway. We're hiding away either in a basement or in an attic. So it's not been too bad. What I have missed is the ability to do research, to go to places where I am writing a book and to actually be on the ground, sniffing the air, feeling, touching the place. That's what I miss at the moment, not being able to do that. I also miss going to all the festivals, all the literary events that are part of the social calendar. I miss that. I mean, I feed off interactions with other people. So for me, it's been quite difficult from that angle. At the same time, look, we've learned we are on Zoom around the world now. It's not quite the same, but it has opened opportunities. I'm talking to you in Lithuania. Maybe this time last year we wouldn't have had this idea for this conversation. And in that sense, there have been some positives. I will be glad when this is all over. But two things. One, we have been lucky, but two, I think we have adapted, or at least as a family, we've adapted in terms of my writing. It's adapted. It's not been easy. Um, there have been times when I have been quite productive, but as I say, that element of research, that element of being in a place which I quite enjoy. I've lost the ability to do that right now. Right now, I'm writing another book set in India. I'm also writing a book which is set in modern day America, and my plan was to be out there for 2 months researching. But my research is all online on Google and on TV now. But that's the way we are.
And by the way, that's one of my question about researches. Do you go to India when you're writing your books? Because all these books are based, all three books which are translated to Lithuanian are based in India. And so do you do lots of field
I
research?
have done. I mean, I've been very lucky in that, ever since I was a child, we have been going to India every few years, for holidays with my parents. My parents are originally from Calcutta, and so as a child we would go. I've grown up understanding the culture. Even when before I started writing, I used to work in finance for 20 years, and a lot of the time I spent traveling to Bombay on business. So, I am familiar with the culture. I'm familiar with being there. In terms of research, some of that, is just, in me because I understand the culture. The cultural research is there. What I find is the things that you take for granted that you get wrong. So, for example, I assumed, having watched too many Indian movies, Bollywood movies, that the color of the police uniforms in Calcutta would be khaki or brown, which is the color that they are throughout the rest of India. But in Calcutta, they are white. And they've always been white since the days of the British. And that's the sort of thing that, unless you're on the ground, you will make a mistake. Similarly, I assumed that the color of the earth, the mud in Calcutta, I thought would be red because it is red in most of India. And
Yes.
in my head, I remember it being red. But when you go on the ground, you realize, well, Calcutta is in the Ganges Delta. The mud is actually black. And so it's these things that you think you know, but you actually don't know that trip you up. And that's why, for me, being on the ground is quite important.
Are
You
these
can
detail important for you?
I think they are and they aren't. You want to make it as, let's take the first one, the color of the police uniforms. If you're writing a crime novel or a novel about the police in a city, something like that you get wrong, and certain people will, pick you up on it. The color of the earth is more something that, on a personal level, I want to get right. I want to make it as authentic as possible. As a writer, there'll always be something that you'll get wrong. So, for example, in book one, I had Sam wearing a certain type of belt, a cross belt. And a reader wrote to me and said in 1919 he wouldn't have worn that type of belt. He would have worn a Sam Brown belt. And so you take that, and you get that sort of feedback, and you have to take it in the spirit that it's meant, which is you take it and you improve your next book. You'll never get everything right. But as a writer, I suppose my job is to maintain that fictional bubble, that bubble that you put the reader into. If you get something wrong, the reader comes out of that fictional world. If they realize you've made a mistake, the reader comes out of this world you're creating, then on one level you've failed. Because as a writer, my job is to create this bubble, this world for you
It's
throughout the book.
believable. Yes.
Yes. And the minute you come out of that, well, some of the magic goes.
Okay, but anyway, I think we can start from the beginning. You said what you worked in finance section, yes, and later you decided to write the books. And why? And why namely crime fiction? Because you wanted to write about India to understand its past,
Mhm.
so probably you could choose, for example, historical fiction, but you just picked crime fiction.
Yeah, I mean, there are several reasons. Let me go back to the beginning of your question. I always wanted to write. I always had this desire to write since I can remember, since being a kid. But like a lot of people, I never had confidence. I never felt I was good enough to write. I never felt I would read a book, and I never felt I could write like that. And so there was always that feeling, and I think a lot of people have that feeling of not being good enough. And then secondly, growing up as the child of immigrants, who came to this country at a time when it was quite difficult. It was a very racist country back then. It's less racist now, but they came in a difficult time and they didn't come with very much. Their first view was that you have to earn a living. You can do what you like, but you have to provide security for your family. So, when I was growing up, the idea of becoming a writer, my parents would have said, fine, you can do that, but you have to do it in your spare time. Get a proper job. And then, so it wasn't really open to me to be a writer at an early age. And as I say, as I got older, I never felt good enough. On a number of occasions, I started writing, so I would write a chapter of a book, and then I would make the mistake of reading that chapter, and I thought, this is awful, and I would put it in a drawer. And I've got a family, I've got work, and life gets in the way. I'm sure a lot of people, all over the world have this. You want to write, but it's a lack of confidence, a lack of time, so many factors. And then at the age of 40, something very odd happened. I was 39. It was 3 months before I was 40. I saw Lee Child on breakfast TV, and he said how at the age of 40 he'd lost his job and he became a writer. And I'd never read any of his work before. And so I picked up the first book and I read it in 2 days. And I thought, this is written very simply, or at least I thought it was written very simply. It was written in small words. Only later did I realize you have to be very skilled to write as simply as Lee Child does. But the book hooked me and it gave me a bit of confidence. So I started writing. I had this idea that I wanted to send a detective to India, and I'll explain why. So I wrote the first 10,000 words of that, and I made the mistake again of reading them. And I thought, this is rubbish, and I put them in a drawer. But then a month later, I saw an advert in a newspaper. There was an article in one of our newspapers in the UK. Penguin were looking for new crime writers, and all they wanted was the first 5,000 words of a novel. And I thought that appealed to me because I'm lazy and I'd already done the work. So I just tidied up the first 5,000 words and I sent it away. I didn't expect to win because I'd never written anything before, never handed anything in. And then 3 months later, I received an email saying, congratulations, you've won. We're going to publish your novel. Except I didn't have a novel. I had these 10,000 rotten words in a drawer. And that was the beginning of the saga. As to why I wanted to write about India and why I wanted to write crime, I grew up reading a lot of different type of literature, crime, science fiction, literary fiction, but I'd always been drawn to crime. It was always my favorite genre. And I grew up in Scotland, where we have this tradition of the crime novel as social commentary. So that, the English had the, Agatha Christie style country house murder. Americans have their gumshoe, hard-boiled detectives. In Scotland, we had, Tartan Noir was very much about looking at social issues through the prism of a crime novel. And that's the tradition that I grew up in. So if I was going to tackle a subject, it felt natural to me to use the crime novel because a policeman, he has access to all levels of society, from princes to prostitutes. And so it's a good vehicle. So it felt natural for me to do my books in that style. What's more, I grew up, the genre that I really loved, or the subgenre, was where you have a good man upholding a system that he doesn't believe in, or a corrupt system. So I loved the works of Martin Cruz-Smith, the Arkady Renko novels set in Moscow. I loved the work of Philip Kerr, the Bernie Gunther novels set in Nazi Germany. But one thing that always hit me was that you had American and British white guys writing about communists and Nazis. Nobody was looking at, no British writer was looking at Britain's own history. Because in Britain, we are very good at managing our history. I think we have been better at managing our own history than any other nation. And it always hurt me that, I would learn something at school and I would come home and my father would tell me, well, that's not the truth. The truth is this. So, and the best example of that was something that happened in 1942, which is known as the Bengal Famine. So while, 3 to 5 million Jews were being massacred in Europe, In India, 3 million Indians were starved to death in a man-made famine. Um, and it was not relieved because Churchill didn't want it relieved, or he didn't allow it to be relieved. Now we hear about one Holocaust, we don't hear about the other. So for me, it was really an attempt to shout about this history that we British don't tell ourselves. Because we don't know our history, I learned more about German history and more about the history of the Soviet Union when I was at school than I did about British colonial history. So, perversely, I knew more about the annexation of Lithuania than I did about colonial times in India. And that is something that really bothered me. And I wanted to talk about these issues in a way that would make British people read it and a wider market. And that was my real reason for writing. I wanted to let people know that there is this history that we don't talk about. We look at our colonial history as if it's like Downton Abbey. We're all drinking tea with the viceroy in India, whereas the effects of that, the mass rape of not just one nation but 1/6 of the globe because of to gratify one small nation is something that we don't talk about. In this country, the majority of people still feel that the empire was a force for good in the world, and that is so far from the truth that it has to be, people have to say something against it. Only now are we seeing, the pulling down of these statues. Only in the last year are we really seeing the people starting to look at British history afresh. I'm sorry, I'm going on a political rant now. I do.
Yeah, but anyway, you have just mentioned this episode at Second World War, but anyway, you just started from the beginning of a 20th century. Why namely that period? Because why, in your opinion, it's such meaningful, and why namely that?
Well, it's a very important period, and what I wanted to look at the period from 1919, which is the end of the First World War, to independence, Indian independence in 1947. I wanted to write a book a year, dealing with each year in that sequence. When I started, that seemed like a good idea, but I'm from Glasgow, and we have the worst mortality rates in Europe, so I don't think I'm going to live to the end of it. But the reason I started there was that for me, that was the beginning of the modern era. My character, my hero, Sam Wyndham, is a survivor of the First World War. He's had his eyes opened. We are a very class-ridden society. Even today, we have a class-ridden society. 100 years ago, it was so much worse. In those days, you did what your betters, your superiors, told you to do. The lords governed, and the lower classes did what they were told. The First World War was the first, letting go of the chains of that, the opening of eyes of people who'd fought in the war and realized that these people who were lords or the upper classes weren't particularly superior in any way. And so my character starts in 1919, partly because it is the beginning of that, modern thinking man from Britain, but also because it was it was the end of the war, but the war didn't really end in India. So the British were told, and the empire was told, that this is a war for freedom and for liberty. And 1 million Indian troops fought in that war for the British. But when they came home, they were not given any freedom. There were actually acts such as the Rowlatt Acts, which stopped them meeting and having any sort of seditious activity. So it seemed like the right point. At the same time, the reason I wanted to look at this particular type of history is that the British and the Indians have a very, I don't know if it's unique, but it's definitely a very special relationship. And it is one that has, I think, in many ways changed the world. If you look at it today in Britain, we have in the center of our democracy, in Parliament Square, there is a statue to Mahatma Gandhi. The man who kicked the British out of India has his statue in the center of our democracy. Now, you go to Paris, you won't see a statue to Ben Bella or Ho Chi Minh. So there's something special in that relationship. you've got to remember the first non-violent freedom struggle in the world that succeeded took place in India. You know, this mass move, the first time it worked, it happened in India. That was then the catalyst for the civil rights movement in America and the catalyst for the, Nelson Mandela's anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. But it started with the British and the Indians. And it takes two parties to do that. You cannot have one party being non-violent and the other being violent. I mean, I was in Ukraine 2 years ago, and they said, why didn't we see more Gandhis? And I think part of the answer is if a similar person had appeared and gone up against Stalin or Hitler, they wouldn't have lasted very long. So there is something special in this relationship. There is something special about these two peoples that they carried out that freedom struggle. And we're seeing that even today in the fact that we have the iconography, the statue of Gandhi in the center of British democracy. What does that say about these two peoples, and what can that say for the world? That was also what I wanted to figure out as part of this journey.
And how do you think all these events, all this society, which has been at the beginning of the 20th century, how it reflects in nowadays India society? What has gone and what still remains?
That is a really, really good question. What I would say is, the empire or India gained independence in 1947, but I think that mentally they were still colonized for another 50 years. I think it was only in the late 90s, with the advent of market reforms, only from the late 90s do I think Indians feel that they are equal to anybody. I think it took 50 years for that colonial mindset, that inferiority, which was, all part of empire, because the empire could not have functioned unless the subject peoples are made to feel inferior. If your subject peoples feel that they are on the same level as you, then firstly, you've lost their willingness to be governed. But secondly, you cannot control them because at least from the British point of view, the way they justified the colonies was by moral superiority. If they do not believe that they are superior to the people they're governing, they have no moral right to be there. And that was fundamental. And it took, I think, 50 years for that colonial mindset in India to drop. The impacts of that today, it's hard to say. A lot of people will say, the British, we left India the railways. It's not true. The British never put the railways in place for Indians. They put the railways in place to extract raw materials and to control the country. It wasn't for the benefit of Indians. There was also, I think, there's still a legacy of laws from the time of the British, which Indian politicians still rely on, anti-progressive laws against, homosexuality and other things, which survive to this day, but were drafted in the time of the British. So, it allows the authoritarian streak in certain Indian politicians to exercise or flex their muscles. So what is the British legacy? As I say, I think it's one where, at the end of the day, Indian democracy has been shaped by the British influence. I do not believe for a minute that India has democracy because of the British. If you look at all of the countries that gained independence from the British Empire, very few have an unbroken record of democracy. India is one of them, and I think that's to do with education and mindset and whatever else. So there is that, but it is still tarnished by some of the laws from the British time. But I think now India stands on its own feet. That inferiority took 50 years to go, but I think now it has gone.
Okay, but when we are talking about these subjects, maybe readers who haven't read your books may think that you are writing political books or serious historical books. But anyway, your books are crime fiction. So how is important for you? You write about, in one way you write about serious subject, but you also want to entertain.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
So this kind of entertainment is the most important for you anyway to write this book, yes?
absolutely. And the question really is, what is the balance? The stories I'm telling have serious messages, and they have serious. I want my readers to think. I want my readers to question what they have been brought up to believe. But that's a difficult task. It's difficult for any of us to question our beliefs. The best way, I think, to do that is by entertaining someone. And if you're asking me what's the balance between entertainment and, political or any other type of awareness, I think it's 90-10. It has to be about entertainment. You have to give your reader the value to read all of your work and get the message. Yeah. So the more I've written, the more I've realized that balance is far more in line with entertainment than it is in terms of pushing my views down somebody's throat. And I think that's the right way to do it. I mean, I asked Val McDermid, who's a very famous Scottish author. I asked her. She's she's been around for 30, 40 years. I said, what do you do? How do you get that balance right? And she said, you write your story. You write your story. You entertain, and you put your message in. You weave it in subtly. That's the best way to do it. And so for me, and also it's more fun that way. For me, writing it, I enjoy writing the story. If I'm just going to, if I just wanted to make a political point, I would just get a megaphone and go to Hyde Park Corner and shout. I'd much rather entertain people. And it's also, you have to remember, we talked about 1942 and the Bengal Famine. That's my ultimate objective, to take my readership to that Bengal Famine. And that's a very, very difficult topic. It's a very difficult topic for me to write. It's a very difficult topic for at least my British audience to appreciate, because they have never been taught it. And in this country, we believe, we are always on the side of the angels. That's the British mentality. Despite the fact that our history is extremely checkered, in this country, you would believe that we are always on the side of right. So when you are giving that message takes time. The only way you can get that message across is by taking people willingly. And you do that by entertaining and building a following.
So maybe it's the fact what some Norwegian writers say, because, in Norwegian culture is also, crime fiction is also very popular. And I think UNESCO's, I think it was in UNESCO who said that if Salman Rushdie was from Oslo, for example, he would write a crime fiction, because the crime writers in Norwegia also, they write about crime fiction, but they also deal with serious social subjects. So I think it's also in Scotland is quite similar. Yes.
I think it is, but I would also say I wouldn't be interested in writing a story that didn't have a message. If I'm not passionate about something, I won't write about it, because it's a year's effort. It's an investment of time and passion and energy, and unless I feel driven to write about something, if I'm not angry about something, I'm not going to write about it. So I think everything I write, whether it's historical or up to date, it has to have a message. It has to have something that I want to say. I don't think I could write a short story just for fun, but if I'm writing a novel, I need to have a message. I need to be, because for me, to be honest with you, Andreas, it's therapy. I write as personal therapy. And so if there is not something that is upsetting me, I'm not going to write. I write about whatever is upsetting me. So, the fourth book in this series, which hopefully will, be translated next year, although it is set in 1921 in India, part of it's set in 1905 in the East End of London, because what was upsetting me when I was writing the book was Brexit and the way we as a country were suddenly reacting to foreigners. This populism, this fear of foreigners and immigrants. And we'd seen it all before. We saw it in 1905 with the Jews. We saw it in the 70s with my parents' community. every so often this happens, and I wanted to talk about that, and that's why I wrote book 4. The 5th book in the series, which is coming out in the UK later this year, I'm angry about what's going on in India right now with the Hindu nationalist government. So a lot of that book focuses on Hindu and Muslim issues. So unless I have an issue to write about, I generally won't write a book.
Okay, and I think people in UK react to your books in one way, and for example, people in India, readers of your books in India, also react in absolutely different way, or not? How people in India just accepted your books?
Do you know what? It's been really interesting. I've had, letters from Indian politicians, so people who sit in the Indian parliament. I've had newspaper articles. The first thing to say is they find it very refreshing.
Mhm.
To have an overseas writer, especially a British writer, writing about India without apologizing is something new. Okay, because when people are writing about India now from a British point of view, they either talk about poverty or they apologize for things that have happened. I'm not apologizing for anyone because I don't think there's any need for an apology, and Indians don't want an apology from some writer or any writer from Britain. Okay? There's no need for that. So I write the stories that I want to, and I'm not favoring the British. If you read what I write, as you have done, you'll notice that if there's a problem on the Indian side, because I sit in the middle, I can point out the hypocrisies on both sides. And what I found, which has really surprised me, is the two people I probably make fun of the most in the books are the Scots and Bengalis. So Bengal is the part of India that Calcutta is in. It's the part of India my parents come from, and those are the two people I love the most because my personality has been formed by those two cultures. Similarly, those are the two cultures and societies that I make fun of.
Yeah.
So what I find is that I get letters or I get people from Scotland saying, "You're very, very horrible to the Bengalis." And I have people in Bengal saying, "You're very horrible to the Scots." So people like to see themselves, joked about, but they think that other people react differently. Everybody wants to laugh at themselves because they recognize the hypocrisies.
Yeah, because you're right, what Bengalians are lazy, they just like sitting and doing nothing. That's the way we
No, we're thinking, not doing
yeah,
nothing.
yeah, yeah, we're just thinking. Yeah, so yeah, it's very interesting to read these lines and to understand what you are. Maybe you are laughing at them, but you do it not in a harmful way. You are
No,
just doing with just
I yeah, I'm lucky that
gentle way.
yeah, it's gentle, but I'm lucky in that I have this shield. I sit between both. I can sound like a Scottish person, I can drink like a Scottish person, and I can look like an Indian. Okay, so I have this camouflage that, I'm like Trump. I can say what I like to these people and not get into trouble.
Yeah,
But it does. It comes from love, and I think the humor in the books is very important to me
yeah.
because
Because I wanted to ask about humor. Is it essential for you in books?
it is, and maybe you can relate to this. I mean, I have never been to Lithuania, but I understand Lithuanian history to the degree that it is similar to some aspects of what we had in colonial times, and I understand. I grew up in Glasgow, which is a very working class city. It's a poor working class, hard city. And I've seen it in Calcutta as well, which is again a poor city. And I have lived in East London, which is again a poor part of London. And I've found that the working class, poor places, hard places like that, develop a sense of humor. That is a coping mechanism. You get through life with a sense of humor. And I would imagine there's a similar thing in Lithuania. One of my favorite books on one of my shelves is a book about communist humor, the jokes made during the communist period, laughing at the regime. And humor is a method by which I think people deal with oppression and they deal with the problems in life. Similarly, if you're writing a crime novel, it's pretty dark stuff. How do you cope with that? How do your characters cope with that? And for me, the answer is what we call gallows humor or black humor. And as I say, I have never been to Lithuania, but I would imagine you probably have a similar type of humor to the type of humors that we have in these books and in these cities.
Yeah, I think many countries like that have this type of humor to survive because
Exactly.
yeah. So and about your main character, I think that many people who read your books sometimes question themselves why this character has to deal with this opium problems. Why did you choose him to have this opium problem? Because I know many crime writers nowadays we like where, for example, Harry Wolf by UNESCO, he has
Yeah.
this alcohol problem and all the dark stuff. You know, all of these people in crime books are dealing with
Mhm.
depression, with
Yeah.
alcohol, with other problems. So you just chosen the
Yeah.
way to do
No,
that as well.
no, it came about for several reasons. I wanted my main character to be damaged. I needed him to be damaged to a degree that India becomes his salvation. That was my starting point. And it wasn't going to happen in one book, it was going to happen as an arc. And, in this first book, he doesn't even want to be there after a week. He wants to get on the next ship back. I needed him to be damaged. So he's lost his wife. He has post-traumatic stress disorder. He is a man with nothing left. He ends up in Calcutta because it's slightly preferable to suicide. That's how he's there. In terms of the opium addiction, there were two things. I was fascinated. I read a book about opium addiction, I think a few years before I started writing. And it was I became fascinated with the subject, all of the paraphernalia, the pipes, etc. And the fact that opium played a big part in financing the British Empire, which is another thing we don't talk about. The fact is that, the British hooked a significant part of the Chinese population on opium, which was grown in India as a way of securing trade. The Chinese didn't want anything the British had. The British wanted tea and other things from China. The Chinese didn't want anything. How do you utilize that balance of payments? You hook the population on drugs, and again, that's something we don't talk about in our past, but it's there, and it's intrinsic to empire. So that opium that the British used to hook the Chinese onto so that they can get tea in return or whatever else was grown in Bengal. And the thing about opium, pure opium, is actually an energizer. It's not the sort of drug that it is when it's cut and it's horrible. And the fact is, a lot of Indians, people like Tagore, who is probably the most famous son of Bengal, the first non-white winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, he came from a family which traded with the British, and amongst the things that they traded was opium. So a lot of India's great families have their wealth tied up in these things with the British. So it's an extremely grey area. And that's why I chose opium. We could have gone for things like alcohol or whatever. But the reason I wanted to give him an opium addiction was because opium was fundamental, firstly, to empire and the ways empire worked, but also it's inextricably linked to this relationship between Britain and India. And again, it gives lie to this idea that the British were all evil and the Indians were all innocent. The fact is that, the story of empire is very, very grey. And that is also part of what I want to bring out in this series of novels. So in book 5, for example, we talk about, the battle that cemented British power in India, the Battle of Plassey. It wasn't financed by the British government or the British crown. It wasn't even financed by the shareholders of the East India Company. It was financed by Hindu merchants in Calcutta who wanted to wrestle control from the Muslims. And so our history is very grey, and that opium is part of that grey history.
And by the way, when you describe opium clubs in Calcutta, you describe them, very atmospherically. And it seems that you have been to some of them, or not. Or
You know,
have you?
they don't exist anymore. There are a
Don't
few
exist, no?
places left. Few places left, not in Calcutta. I think you have to go to Laos, Cambodia and Laos. And I discussed this with my wife, and we had a conversation, and we decided that I wasn't allowed to go. Unfortunately. So my research had to be from books.
Okay, but I know many writers when we say about their main characters, they say what some part of them is in these main characters as well. And can you say about yourself?
Yeah.
Do you think that the main character has something from you?
Well, I see it as two main characters. We have Sam
Yeah.
Wyndham and we have the young Indian sergeant Surendranath Banerjee. And to be honest with you, they're both part of me. You know, Sam is my cynical Scottish / British side, and Suren is my much more innocent, light-hearted side. He also has my very skinny legs, which doesn't, you know, so they both are parts of me. They are both the two sides of my personality, which are constantly trying to figure out how to live with each other. The British side and the Indian side, who always notice the contradictions. So, my Indian side will notice a contradiction in British society, or my British side will notice a hypocrisy on my Indian side. And these two characters are really the two voices in my head, the commentary in my head, when commenting on the other side. So really, they are me. They are two sides of my personality commenting on the relationship between them and on the external world.
And we already talked about your researches.
Mm-hmm.
And how accurate are your books? For example, when you deal with, for example, you have read the third book, how accurate are historical events which you describe in this book?
They tend to be quite accurate. I mean, if something is written in black and white in the history books, I will not change it. So I will not, suddenly save JFK or anything like that.
But how far do you go to interpret it?
Yeah, I tend to. There's two things. One, I will play in the gaps. So my characters suddenly become heroic in an actual historic event. I'm happy doing that as long as I'm not changing the narrative of the actual history. But what I'm also trying to do, especially let's take book 3, Smoke and Ashes, I'm trying to bring greater attention to people whom I think more attention should be given to. So in book 3, it's Chittaranjan Das and his wife, who, when he was arrested, got up on stage and energized not just Calcutta but the whole of India in this freedom struggle. These people I want to see given the attention they deserve. So I put my characters in there. I will not let them take credit for other people's work, and I will not change the outcome of things. But I like history. I like the framework of history, and I like the spaces. I like the blank spaces where I can put my characters and they can play.
And by the way, when you write about India, you write about chaos, which prevails in India. And I've been many times to India, and it always surprised me how this India is overwhelmed with chaos, but everything is organized anyway. Everything works, and so I think it's a culture where chaos is just as natural as breathing, for example. Doesn't it surprise you as well?
I have grown used to it and I've grown to embrace it. I think when you go to India, the first thing you have to do is, if they give you a schedule, you just got to put it to one side. It'll happen. All the events will happen. Just get rid of the times. Okay? So
Yeah.
Your first event won't start at 9. It'll start at 11 and you'll be doing it till midnight. But that's just part of the joy of India. It's very difficult to explain how that happens, but there is such a thing as Indian time, which is generally 5 hours after whatever is advertised. There is this chaos. There's this national method of just bungling through things, getting through things. It'll work. Don't worry too much. It'll happen. And I don't know what is the core of that. But when you embrace it, once you stop worrying about your timetable, your life becomes a lot more enjoyable in India. And there is a certain charm to it. There's a certain peace to knowing that nobody is governed by this timetable that you've been given. It'll happen. We'll do it at some point.
Somehow it happens anyway. The bus may become 5 hours later, but it will come anyway.
I think it's also linked to, the biggest logistics operation in the world, or one of them, is the tiffin service in Bombay, which you may be aware of. So basically every morning, millions of salary workers go off to work. Little man comes to each of their houses, picks up their lunch, And through a system of few notes, illiterate people through a system of few notes will make sure that this lunch from this house gets to that desk on the other side of town by lunchtime. Millions of these happening each day, and very few ever get lost. And I think that's also part of the same thing. It's this organized chaos. And that is India. And I don't know where it comes from, but once you realize the magic in it, you embrace it, it becomes a lot easier.
And I think there are some books written about these things of delivering meal in Bombay. And anyway, let's return to your crime book. What, in your opinion, makes a crime book a very good crime book? What's the main elements?
For me, there are a couple of really good things. I mean, tension. I like. Well, let's do it backwards. For me, the best crime books are those that entertain and educate. So if I come away learning something from a book, or opening my mind to an idea I hadn't thought of before, that for me is a huge plus. That puts in a separate category. But at the same time, you need that entertainment. You need that plot. You need a plot to be tight. I must say, I'm old-fashioned. I still love the idea of the reader being able to play along and work out who did it before the end. These days, yeah, I want that. I love the idea that the reader is there. I love putting in some clues for the reader. I wonder who picks up on what. And for me, the perfect novel or crime novel is one where the reader has a chance to solve it, enjoys the plot, but is also blindsided by something. They think they're going one way, and then suddenly everything goes like that. That wow moment is brilliant. But also, I want to learn something. If I come away having learned something and having a different appreciation for something, that's very important to me. And I think a lot of people feel that way. We want to be challenged. Why do we read? We read to be entertained, but we read to expand our horizons. And part of that is challenging people's views.
And how do you write? Do you have a plan for each book, and do you have just know how the book will end, or you just begin writing the book and say, okay, we'll see how it develops?
Audrius, I was an accountant for 20 years. How do you think I tried on book 4, I tried to just start writing and write. And I spent 3 months going around in a circle. For me, I like to have an idea of where the book will go. So I will generally do a lot of research. The way I write is I will choose a topic that interests me. So let's take the second book. I wanted to learn about the world of the Maharajas. Even at the height of the British Empire, 2/5 of India was still ruled nominally by these Maharajas, these princes. And they were the richest men in the world in their day. They were as rich as the Saudis today. And I knew I wanted to write about that. So I started researching that period. I read a lot. And as I did that research, I found that what really was interesting was the role of the women, the Maharanis, the princesses, the women, the concubines. These guys married hundreds of women. And what surprised me was that, it was the women who ran these countries. A lot of the time, they were the ones who did investments in education, in health, and they did it from the harem. We think of the harem as a pleasure palace, but really it was a center of political power for the women. And to me, that was really exciting. So that's what I wanted to write about. Then I spend, basically I'll spend the time putting a skeleton together. I'll know how it starts, I'll know how it finishes, and I will do a 2 to 3 page skeleton of what I think is going to happen. And then I'll start writing. And when I get about a third to a half of the way through, I will do another skeleton on the second part, flesh it out a bit more. And then when I get to about 80%, 90%, that ending has to be right. So I then go through the process again. So it's iterative. I need that plan, but it's very light planned. But as I go along, I'll replan and then replan towards the end again. And that's, so far that's been the way I've done things.
And what are the biggest lessons? Because you have 5 books in your pocket right now, and what are the biggest lessons which you learned from the book number 1 to your last book, which you are writing right now?
That is a great question. I've learned so much. I mean, I learned to write from my editor on that first book. Between the first and second draft of book one of A Rising Man, the Calcutta Detective, that is when I really learned how to write, or I learned so much of what I've learned in that period. What have I learned? I've learned to say more with fewer words. I've learned to be more subtle. I've learned to trust my readers, and I've learned what matters and what doesn't matter. You know, at the end of the day, in book one, for example, I researched the Calcutta sewer system because I wanted to do something in the sewers. And because I spent, 2 days researching, I had to show everybody how smart I was. So I wrote a chapter on the Calcutta sewer system. And my editor just cut it out, and nobody needs to know that. And so I've learned things like that. I've learned what is necessary for the novel. I've learned what is necessary to push it forward. I've also learned how to get my message across without pushing it down somebody's throat. So yeah, I've learned a lot. But having said that, I'll wake up tomorrow and I'll feel I don't feel good enough to write anything. So although I haven't learned confidence. I'll get up and I will think, what am I doing? Tomorrow's the day people are going to find out I can't write. So it's odd. It's odd. I feel I've got the tools. Okay. I think over the last 5 years, I have collected the tools of writing. I still don't think I can use them properly yet. That's my concern. I'm still, if I was a carpenter, I've got all the tools now, and now I'm starting to, chisel. But it's tough. It's a really good question. And I have to be honest with you. I can't say that I have learned half as much as I want to learn, or I feel I have so much more to learn. I think that's a better way of putting it.
And look, at many readers right now know your name, what you are, the crime writer who writes about India. But don't you think what one day you will want to write about, other subject, and maybe
Absolutely. And
and
that's
are you not afraid what people will say? Okay, here's the writer who writes about India. Why he writes, for example, about Paris or about America? Or why doesn't he write crime fiction? Why does he write historical fiction? What's wrong with him?
Well, Audrius, you know what? That's a very timely question because right now I'm writing a book which is set in modern day America, a thriller, and that will come out probably next year sometime. So we will answer your question in real time, I think. Am I worried? I tell you what, I feel writing this book, because this is the first time I've written a book which isn't historical fiction, it isn't set in India. It feels, there's a certain joy to doing this one, which I had from the first Sam Wyndham book. It's the same feeling of completely new to me. So that there's a joy in writing every book, but there's a certain joy in writing a first book. And I'm getting some of that again. I'm enjoying this process. To an extent, I can do the Sam Wyndham books. I've learned a lot. This feels like new things I'm learning every day. But at the same time, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Why am I writing a book set in America today? I'm writing about a book set in America today because it's about radicalization. It's about how people become radicalized. And I've been writing this book for 18 months. And it's only in the last 2 months that we've been seeing that really play out in America. We saw the attack on the Capitol in Washington. Now, in a sense, I'm very upset because my whole book was predicated on people not being aware of the threat. And suddenly everybody's aware of the threat. Now I have to think, well, how do I make my book more interesting? So there's at least with history, it's written. Nobody's going to come along and change the narrative. Okay, so I'm pretty safe. Now I'm writing something modern, and events can change it like that. So we will find out. We'll find out what people will say. But I would hope, because there are so few writers who aren't white, white men, at least in Britain and America, I would hope that I'm approaching the subject from an angle that not many people have done before or have thought about before. The way I describe it is, I'm a British writer. All I'm doing is I'm moving the camera. Normally, a British writer or a white writer will look at a subject like this. But my view is always from here. or here because I sit between cultures. So again, hopefully I'm giving you a different camera angle on what's happening in America today and what's happening in Europe today than you would be used to from somebody who may be a white British writer or a white American writer.
Yeah, and you said what before becoming a writer, you just had this job which you didn't like, and right now, as I understand, you are a professional writer. Yes,
That's
you live
right.
from writing,
Mhm.
and I know what it's not. It's a kind of luxury because not so many people are living from
Ah,
writing books, and some people think what it's a dream to live as a writer, as a professional writer. But what are disadvantages of being a professional writer, not writing for your, just for example, Orwell once said that the writer doesn't have to live from writing because he has to do it in spare time. And what is the biggest disadvantage of being a writer?
I would say to Orwell, he was never an accountant, so he can't say that. If he was an accountant, he would never have said that. He was a journalist. I can understand it. That's a really good question, Audrius. Nobody's really ever asked me that. I suppose the thing I miss most is just the daily interactions with more people. As a writer, it's very easy to live in a bubble, a small bubble. Whereas when you go out, especially with the sort of job I used to do, I used to travel the world. I was always meeting people. I missed that element. Even as a writer, we had some elements of that, but that's gone by the wayside in the last year. Um, but really, I don't miss this. This is a dream. This is a dream, and it's a dream that I'm very, very fortunate to be enjoying. I like to think I've paid my time. I've done my 20 years in prison of accounting, and now I'm a free man to do writing. But I'm very lucky. It is a dream come true for me to be able to write. There are very few downsides that I can think of. I'll be honest with you. Who if you have this desire to write, what can be better than to be able to do it without concern? And that for me is very important. Now, this may change. You know how difficult it is to build a career these days. Maybe two bad novels and that could be it. Maybe this is as good as it gets. Now, my job is really to keep pushing and improving and getting better and better so that I can continue to do the job that I love. And I am aware of what an honor and a privilege it is to be able to do that. And, I'll give you an example. In my old job, I would travel to many countries with work, but I would remember getting on the plane and feeling a sense of dread. I didn't want to make that journey. I didn't want to get to the other end. I didn't want to do what I had to do. Now, if I'm going to talk to somebody in another country, I look forward to getting on the plane. I look forward to getting in the car and making the journey to a literary festival or something like that. It doesn't feel like work. It feels like the best feeling I can have. The best use of my life is to do these things.
And anyway, I think many people live right now as professional writers, not interacting so much, just living at home during coronavirus. But I wanted to ask about your audience. Where do you have the biggest audience? Where do most of your readers come from? What countries? And have you had something from Lithuania, for example?
Hmm. Do you know what? As you would imagine, the first market was always Britain. So my biggest readership, in terms of percentage of the crime reading population that know of me, and it would be Britain. Um, then America, probably second in terms of numbers, but it's a much bigger market and I have much smaller sales. Europe is really interesting. Europe is it started off in Germany, but really the countries that have really taken to it have been places like first Italy and now France. And this year the first book came out in Spain. Lithuania was one of the first countries to take the books. Uh,
Yeah.
several former Soviet nations have taken the book. I think possibly because of the parallels. People can see their own history in some of these stories. They can see the relationships. They can see the power politics play out. Um, and that's really quite interesting to me. As I mentioned, I've been to Ukraine, where I think a lot of these stories resonate. I would imagine that there are parallels with your own history in Lithuania. I mean, I remember the days of Vytautas Landsbergis. I remember
Oh,
Lithuania being the first part of the Soviet Union to, to break away, and we would watch it fascinated, or at least I, as a schoolboy, would be fascinated by seeing these things, because we knew nothing of that. We knew only of this monolith, and the fact that you have individuals there, you have all of these people that are the same as us, again, was amazing. But it's the same thing in colonial history. We think of it as a them and us, but when you get below the surface, the relationships between individuals are what matter. And to me, that was fascinating. And so it's taken off. India is a very interesting one. India is a huge market. The books are very popular in English. Um, but the thing about the Indian market is, you can buy a book in the bookshop for 900 rupees, or you can walk outside round the corner and you can pick up the forged version for 20 rupees or 100 rupees. So people tell me they're very popular in India, but I don't see any of the money. So yeah, it's great. I love it. I love the fact that people, my father, when I was writing these novels, when I was writing the first book, and I told him what it was about, he said, "Are you sure people will want to read about this history?" And he didn't live to see the first book come out. He passed away just before it came out. But people. It seems that people do want to read these stories about this history, and I think that to me is amazing. The fact that someone in Lithuania and someone in Vilnius or whatever will want to read something that I've written is it's very humbling. It's extremely humbling that there's people in Japan or Ukraine or Lithuania or America who are interested in these stories and also this history. Is I dedicated the first book to my father, and I like to think of all of this as something that he would look down on and say, "Wow, you've done all right. You've told people about our history," and I think that's important.
and by the way, who is the first person who reads your new book?
Well, my wife, always my wife. Because I can trust her. She doesn't have to tell me anything. She if it's rubbish, she will tell me this is just nonsense. What are you doing? And I can go and clean the bathrooms, and I will go and clean the bathroom, and then oh, so yeah, always my wife, and whenever I send a draft, she has to be standing there holding my hand before I press send. Otherwise, bad things will happen. So yeah, always my wife.
Okay, and so I think we just talked about many subjects, and we discussed your books, and I think that your new book will be in Lithuania very soon, because we have 3 books and all of them have. I think we've got great success, and I think what your next book about America, it will be also very interesting, and it will be very fascinating to see how do you do in another way. And anyway, maybe you have some last words for your Lithuanian readers, and what would you like to say?
I would like to say, firstly, thank you to you, Audrius, for this wonderful interview, and I would like to say thank you to all of the readers in Lithuania who have read the books and taken the books to their heart. It's very humbling for me, as a little boy from Scotland whose parents came from India, the fact that you wonderful people are reading the history of my family's past and my people's past is amazing, and I'm honored, and I would love to one day come to Lithuania and to meet some of you, and yeah, I would love that. So thank you so much. Thank you for reading the books. Thank you, Tito Alba, for publishing the books, and I hope one day to say thank you in person.
Thank you for your great stories, and goodbye.
Thank you, Andres.